Mazel tov to all of the Messiahim of Mesechta Eiruvin. It's been a long journey, 104 blot of Gemara, and a challenging Mesechta, a difficult Mesechta. You plowed through the Mesechta in one way or another, day in, day out. Mazel tov to all those who finished Mesechta Eiruvin, to all those who will finish Mesechta Eiruvin, and to all those who will be inspired from the siyum of Mesechta Eiruvin to continue learning Mesechta Pesachim and to continue learning and growing in your learning. It's a great moment to be able to celebrate with all of you and all of us. Shachiyanu v'keimanu v'giyanu lizman hazeh, and thank you for joining us for this siyum and Hadran on Mesechta Eiruvin. The siyum I'm going to be teaching tonight, Be'ezer Hashem, is based on a siyum and Hadran Mesechta Eiruvin that was made by the Lubavitcher Rebbe on the yahrzeit of his father, Chaf of Tovshin Chaf Beis, the 20th of 1962. The Lubavitcher Rebbe used to publicly make around 6 siyumim or hadranim on Mesechtas throughout the year at different occasions, including the yahrzeit of his father-in-law, the yahrzeit of his father, the yahrzeit of his mother, and other occasions, Yotes Kislev, and on his birthday, and Erev Shavuos, and Chamisha B'Av, or different occasions during the year. Sometimes you would make a siyum on the whole Shas. Sometimes you would make a siyum on an individual Mesechta. Sometimes you'd make a siyum on on a few Mesechtas together. Sometimes on the Mesechta in Bavli and Yerushalmi. That particular day, Chaf Av, is the yahrzeit of his father. His father's name was Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson. Died in Stalin's Gulag, in the exile. He was exiled to Kazakhstan in 1939. And in 1939 he was arrested during the Stalin purges. He was the Rav of the Dnepropetrovsk in the Ukraine. And he was arrested and exiled and to Kazakhstan. They gave him permission to move to a place, Alma-Ata, but he was very ill and he passed away in the summer, August of 44. Every year on the 20th of Av, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would hold a Farbrengen, and during the Farbrengen, he would make a siyum on a Mesechta. That particular year, Tovshin Chav Beis 62, the Rebbe made a siyum on Mesechta Eiruvin. Years later, he made another siyum on Eiruvin, on Yerushalmi Eiruvin. I was already there. That was the yahrzeit of his father-in-law, the Rebbe Rayatz Tovshin Mem Gimel, Yud Shvat Tovshin Mem Gimel, 1983. But we're focusing on this siyum of Tovshin Chav Beis 1962. A big part of it was published in his Likutei Sichos, volume 11, Parshas B'Shalach, which is the parsha that deals with various subjects of Shabbos and Eiruvin. So Likutei Sichos, volume 11, Parshas B'Shalach, this siyum is published. And anybody who wants can listen to it. Today you have the MP3s, you can hear it. It was a weekday Farbrengen. It was a siyum that went for, I think, close to 2 hours. And you can also read it in the Likutei Sichos, which we will be posting here on the PDF, the source sheets. If you open up the source sheets at the end of the class, you'll see the whole Sichos, so you could learn it inside if you want. But we have source sheets, the first page of the source sheets that we're going to be using, and let's begin the siyum. I'm planning, Be'ezer Hashem, to divide this shir into 2 sections. The first section is going to be the Rebbe's explanation in the sugya of the Mishnah and the Gemara, an insight of the Rebbe into this sugya, and then the next part of the shir is going to be the spiritual explanation of the neshama of Mesechta Eiruvin. So it's going to be 2 different parts of the siyum. Now, I would have loved to explore the entire siyum of the Rebbe, the entire Hadran of the Rebbe, but it would be much longer and a lot of shiurim. So because of the constraints of time, I do have to say that I'm taking out one point in the first section of the siyum and another point in the other section of the siyum, although there's many other points, but we have to use Kayach HaTzimtzum and limit ourselves to just a few points. Let's begin. Open your source sheets. We're going to learn the last mission of Mesechta Eiruvin. That's what you do in a siyum, which is Eiruvin Daf Kuf Daled Amud Beis. Zog the Mishnah. Sheretz shenimtze b'mikdash. A dead sheretz, a dead insect. There are 8 creeping creatures called the Shmeina Shratzim that after they die, they impart impurity. And if I touch it, I become tameh. For example, a dead weasel, a dead mouse, a dead lizard, a dead mole. They're mentioned in Parshas Shmini. So if you have such a dead sheretz, and it's found in the mikdash, it happens. A weasel is dead in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, we're not allowed to have tumah in the Beis HaMikdash. So Mikdash has to be a place of purity. So the sheretz has to be dealt with. It has to be taken out. But here's the problem. The kohen, if he just comes and takes the sheretz and throws it out of the Beis HaMikdash, what happens? He becomes tameh. A kohen is not supposed to allow himself to become tameh, especially when he is in the Beis HaMikdash, because a kohen who's tameh is not allowed to be in the Beis HaMikdash. It's actually a very serious transgression. So what do? Says the Mishnah, kohen maitziyoi behemiyonoi shaloi leishas esatumah. The kohen takes his gartel, his sash, his belt, and he lifts up the dead sheretz with his gartel, and he gets rid of it. So what happens now? What happens is as follows. The kohen himself doesn't get tameh. The gartel gets tameh because it touched the sheretz. The halacha by sheretz is, very briefly, a sheretz is called an av hatumah. It's a source of tumah. When it touches something, that something becomes what's called a vlad hatumah, a child of tumah, the second generation. The sheretz is the first generation, the tati of tumah, av hatumah. And then there's the recipient of that tumah that's called rishon l'tumah, the first child of vlad hatumah. So the gartel, the belt, the sash of the kohen is a beged, it's a garment which is susceptible to tumah. So it becomes tameh. It becomes tameh. But the kohen himself doesn't become tameh. And the reason is because a human being, or actually a utensil as well, a human being, a garment, a bowl, let's say a wooden bowl, a metal bowl, only can become impure if they come in contact with the source of tumah, not with the second generation, not with the vlad hatumah, which is also called rishon l'tumah. If the kohen would have touched the sheretz directly, he would have become tameh. That's forbidden. But he didn't touch the sheretz. The gartel touched the sheretz. So the gartel is a rishon. Now the kohen can't become tameh from that. So therefore, if the gartel, by the way, would touch food, let's say the gartel would touch bread or meat, it would become tameh, because food is more sensitive. Food or liquid can become tameh from a garment that touched a sheretz, but the kohen himself would not. Now, even though the kohen is carrying it, a sheretz will not impart purity when you carry it, only when you touch it. So therefore, the kohen gets rid of the sheretz, shaloi lishais es hatumah, so that the tumah does not remain in the Beis HaMikdash. We don't want it to remain there even for an extra moment, and therefore, the kohen takes his gartel, even though the gartel is now going to become tameh, and it's going to have to be purified in the mikveh. That's fine. Divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. Rabbi Yehuda says no. B'tzvas shel eitz. Let the kohen find tongues of wood, wooden tongues, and pick up the dead sheretz, the dead insect with these wooden tongues, and take it out of the Beis HaMikdash. What's the advantage? The halacha is that pshutei klei eitz, which means wooden vessels that don't have a cavity, are not susceptible to tumah. So if I have a wooden bowl or a wooden cup and the sheretz would fall into it, that wooden vessel would become tameh. But if I have if I have wooden tongues, a tzvas is like a plier, a tzvengel, or tongues. If I have wooden tongues, it's flat. It doesn't have a cavity inside. It's not an open vessel that contains something inside. So therefore, if I lift up the dead sheretz with the wooden tongues, it's wonderful. The kohen is not tameh, his garment is not tameh, and these pliers are not tameh. So that's what you should do. Shaloi l'Rabbi says hatumah. Even though, this is how the Gemara explains it, even though by waiting to find wooden tongues, the sheretz will probably be there for much longer. Because if the kohen takes his belt, he's always wearing an avneit. A kohen serving in the Beis HaMikdash has to wear 4 garments. He has to be wearing a hat, he has to be wearing a shirt, he has to be wearing pants, and he has to be wearing a sash, an avneit. So he always has it available. So therefore, he just lifts up the sheretz, he takes it out. So what happens? The sheretz is gone immediately, but the belt is tameh. But if he has to go find wooden tongues, it may be right there. He may have to look for it. There may have to be a search committee. It may take 5 minutes, it may take 5 hours. Somebody may have to bring it. Whatever is the case, whatever the situation is, it's going to delay getting rid of the sherets. So he says, but Shaloi leRabbi says Hatumah. Rabbi Yehuda says, I would rather if the tumah is there longer, as long as you don't increase the tumah. In other words, the wooden tongues are not going to become tameh. That's the advantage of using wooden tongues over the belt of the kohen. So we have an argument between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika and Rabbi Yehuda. Then the Mishnah goes on to discuss the location of where the sheretz is, which part of the Beis HaMikdash it is. Does the halacha change if it was in the Heichel, if it was in the Azara? That's the next part of the Mishnah. And by the way, this debate is true about Shabbos. It's also true about the weekdays. Whenever there's a dead sheretz in the Beis HaMikdash, how should it be dealt with? Comes the Mishnah, and now moves on to a different topic, which is very perplexing. Reb Shimon says, and I'm going to translate, Mokim sheitiru lach hachamim mishalach nosnu lach shelo yitiru lach ela mishum shvus. Wherever the sages allowed you to do something, you should realize that they gave you what belongs to you, because they only allowed you to do it if it was a rabbinic prohibition. Now you're asking, what is the connection? We just spoke about a dead sheretz in the Beis HaMikdash, how the kohen should take it out, with his belt or with wooden tongues. Where did we discuss something that warrants this statement from Reb Shimon? How do I know it's a good question? Because the Gemara asks it. And this is the last piece of Gemara of Mesechta Eiruvin. Eiruvin Daf Kuf Hey Amud Aleph, Eiruvin 105a, which ends the Mesechta, analyzes these last words of Reb Shimon, which concluded the last Mishnah of Mesechta Eiruvin and Kuf Daled Amud Beis. Says the Gemara. Let's see the Gemara inside. Reb Shimon Aimer, Reb Shimon Hey Chakai. What is Reb Shimon referring to? What are his words relating to? They seem to be introduced here in a vacuum. There's no relationship to anything that was said before. So the Gemara says, you're right. Reb Shimon is a continuation to a Mishnah that was written way, way back in Eiruvin, the end of chapter 4, Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis. And the Mishnah says, Heichakai, Hasam Kai de Tanan. We learned in a Mishnah 6 chapters ago, Mi shehech shechutz l'tchum, afilu ama achas lo yikones. Reb Shimon Omer, afilu chamesh esrei ama yikones, lefei she'ena meshuches b'matzines amidus b'pnei atoinim. Dika amar Tanakama lo yikones, v'amar le Reb Shimon yikones. So the Gemara says, let me explain to you, we'll give you context. Earlier in Mesechta Eiruvin, we had a very interesting argument between Tanakama and Reb Shimon. What was the argument? It was a situation of Mi shehech shechutz l'tchum. Let's remember the facts so we can appreciate what the Gemara is teaching us here. We all know there's something called Tchum Shabbos, which is the border of Shabbos. The pasuk says in Beshalach, Al yetze ish mimkaimai b'yom hashvi. A person should not leave his place, or her place, on the 7th day. Don't leave your place on the 7th day. From here, the Chachamim learned out that there's something called the border of Shabbos, Tchum Shabbos. There's something called your space on Shabbos. This is your space. And I'm not allowed to go out of this space on Shabbos. This is called the border, which I should not be crossing on Shabbos. I can walk till the border, but I should not cross the border on Shabbos. This is called Tchum Shabbos. What is this Tchum Shabbos? So if I am in a town or a village in a city, I could walk throughout the entire city, as large as it is. Plus, I can leave the city and walk in each direction 2,000 amos. 2,000 amos would be, contemporary numbers, it would be between 3,000 and 4,000 feet. Because an amma is approximately 1.5 feet or 2 feet. There's an argument about the exact contemporary measurement. You have Reb Chaim Na, who says an amma is a little more than 18 inches. I think 18.18, a little more than 18 inches is an amma. So it's 1.5 feet, maybe a little more. You have Reb Moshe Feinstein, puts a little higher. You have the Chazon Ish, who says it's almost 2 feet. It's like around 23 inches, 23 plus. So let's say 2,000 amos is between 3,000 and 4,000 feet. So it's on Shabbos. I go to the end of the city, and then I could walk another 2,000 amas, say another 3,000 or 4,000 feet. But that's the Tchum Shabbos. And there were markers. At Kan Tchum Shabbos, there were markers till where's the Tchum Shabbos. And this is my border. I'm now allowed to go out of that Tchum Shabbos. That's if I'm in a city. What if I'm not in a city? What if I am? What if I'm in a house somewhere in the forest? What if I have an isolated home somewhere in the wilderness, somewhere in the mountains? What then? Then on Shabbos I could walk around the whole house, no problem. And when I leave the house, I could choose any direction and go 2,000 amas outside of the house. So I could take a stroll 3 or 4,000 feet outside of the house. If I'm in a city, then I could walk till the end of the city plus another 2,000 amas. Right. What happens if I'm not in a house? I'm camping out in the forest. I'm just camping out on Shabbos, right? I pitch a tent and I'm there. I don't have a house. So then, I have my 4 cubits, called my Dalet Amas, which is around 6 or 8 feet, and from there, 2,000 Amas. That's called Tchum Shabbos. Asks the Mishnah, what happens if somebody was coming to the city before Shabbos, but mi shehechshe chutz l'tchum? You know what? When night fell, when Shabbos arrived, Friday night arrived, he did not enter into the border of the city for Shabbos. Let's say he's coming. He doesn't manage to get into the 2,000 amas outside of the city. So Tanakama says, you can't go in. Lo yikanes, you can't go in. Because since Misha afilu ama achas lo yikanes, he can't go in even 1 ama. That's what Tanakama says. Reb Shimon says, afilu chamesh esrei ama yikanes. Even. Let me just correct myself. I'll be a little clearer. If a person goes mishach shechutz l'tchum means I decide that I want to be Friday night when Shabbos comes in. What's considered the place from where 2,000 amas begins? It begins from the place where you settled down when Shabbos began. Or even if you were not there physically, there's something called Eiruvin, you could put your meal there. If you put your meal there, your meal is there, so it's like your presence, you have a presence there, so then from there you could walk 2,000 amas as long as you can get to that place on Shabbos. So it says, Misha hechshe chutz l'tchum. If somebody, when Shabbos arrives, they are outside of the border of Shabbos from the city. They're not inside the border. If they're inside the border, wonderful. Then they could walk back wherever they want. But they are outside of the border. They apparently want to walk in the other direction. So Tanakama says, you're outside of the border. Your 2,000 amas begin here. You can't go back. Reb Shimon says something very interesting. Reb Shimon says, even if you walked out of the border 15 amas, which means approximately 30 feet further, almost 30 feet further, you could still go back. You know why? Reb Shimon says, because when they made the markers, they were never accurate. They lechatchila made the markers in a way to allow for error, because they knew that people are sometimes absent-minded, they stroll Shabbos, and they don't realize, and they go a little further. So therefore, they made the markers earlier. So Reb Shimon says, you still have 15 amas to go. You went out of the Tchum 15 amas. You didn't really go out of the Tchum 15 amas, because they usually made the marker at the end of the border earlier than they had to, because they knew that people make an error. There are other interpretations of why they did it, whether it's because of the way they held the ropes and it was inaccurate. But the bottom line, Reb Shimon says, even though you're coming back and you're already outside of your border, Reb Shimon says, not necessarily. You may be outside of the border, but you may also not be outside of the border. You know why? Because the markers are sometimes earlier than they belong. They are not in the accurate place. So therefore, even though you walked further, so you are now 50 amas or within 50 amas away from the Tchum. Reb Shimon says you can turn around as though you never left the Tchum Shabbos. You're good. That's what Reb Shimon says. Argument between Tanakama and Reb Shimon. Says the Gemara, that's what he means here. Reb Shimon says, let's see Rashi, Yikones, see? The Mishalach Nosnolach, Shekvar Hu B'Tech Tchumai. That's what Reb Shimon means. Mokim Shetir L'Chacham Mishalach Nosnolach. The Chachamim they allowed you to come back. They were giving you your own space. Mishalach Nosnolach. They were allowing you to come back because you're still in your Tchum. Mishalach Nosnolach. If you really left the Tchum Shabbos, they wouldn't let you come back. But Mishalach Nosnolach. They're giving you this ability to come back. Why? So as Rashi says, Shekvar Hu B'Teich Tchumai. Because you're still in the Tchum. V'hach asher Reb Shimon l'meisav taimed l'milsa. L'loi teimem mekel ani be'isser Shabbos. Ele mishaloi nasati loi. Reb Shimon is saying, why is he saying this? He's saying, don't think I'm being lenient on Shabbos. I'm not being lenient on Shabbos. I believe in Tchum Shabbos. If you left the Tchum, you left the Tchum. You can't go back. You have a different Tchum. My issue is, he never left the Tchum. They made a mistake. The markers are in the wrong place. I'm giving you your own. I'm not taking money. It's like I'm not taking money from somebody else and giving it to you. I'm giving you back what you own. It's just yours. I'm letting you come back, right, into the Tchum that you still are in. Mishalach nosnulach. That's what Reb Shimon is saying. So now we understand what Reb Shimon means. He's justifying and rationalizing and explaining what he said a few chapters ago. That's what he's doing. I'll ask why here. Okay. Then the Gemara continues. What's this about? What is this about? Hasimkai. The Kamer Tanakama Koshra. Va'amar le'Reb Shimon oinva. Aniva de'layasil le'chiyuv chatas. Shara le'rabanan. Kshira de'asil le'chiyuv chatas. Le'shara le'rabanan. Earlier, Daf Kuf Beis, there was an argument in Gemara. Let's say a Ben Levi is playing the harp on Shabbos. In the Beis HaMikdash, they had music, symphonies every day. They had vocalists and they had musicians, even on Shabbos. And therefore, a Levi could be playing a harp on Shabbos. And what happens if a chord snaps? Nimas kino shenifsika. It snaps, it breaks. What's the halacha? Tanakama said he's allowed to tie it. He's allowed to tie it even on Shabbos. Reb Shimon said oinva. You're only allowed to make a bow. You can't tie it. You have to make a bow. That's what Reb Shimon says. Koshra, Tanakama, you're allowed to tie it. Some say what Tanakama means is that mamish even allowed to make a permanent knot on Shabbos. That's what Rashi says. Other Rishonim say it doesn't mean a permanent knot. It means you're allowed to make a regular knot, but you have in mind that it's not permanent. And since it's not permanent, so therefore it's not a biblical prohibition. Even though you may forget and leave it as permanent, but they allowed it in the Beis HaMikdash. Reb Shimon says, no knot whatsoever. You make a bow. That's what Reb Shimon says earlier in the Gemara Daf Kuf Beis. So the Gemara says, Reb Shimon is now again justifying his position. When I make a bow on Shabbos, it could never bring to a biblical prohibition where I'm going to have to bring a carbon chatas. You know why? Because a bow could never be a biblical prohibition. It's not called a knot. But if you let him make a knot, what can happen? He may make a knot, and even if it's an impermanent knot, but what happens if he makes a knot and he leaves it there? So then, it's a biblical prohibition. So therefore the Rabbanan don't allow it. So even though making a bow, according to the Shimon, is also not allowed to, but it's only a rabbinical prohibition. And therefore, the Beis HaMikdash, he says you can do it, because Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, they allowed most rabbinical prohibitions. They weren't strict about rabbinic prohibitions. But a knot, a regular knot, not a bow, which can bring you to a biblical prohibition, it can bring you to one. Because even according to Rashi, that you're allowed to do it. According to Tanakama, nonetheless, you may do it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, etc. So therefore, the Chachamim did not allow it. So Rabbi Shimon is explaining that the heter of making a bow is only because it's a shvus, and in the Beis HaMikdash you can do a shvus, but a knot which may not be a shvus, even though you're doing an impermanent knot, so it is a shvus, but it can bring to a dairais, so that we're not going to allow in the Beis HaMikdash. Sorry. So Rashi says, Kaishra, benimas kinner shenifseko, talking about the cord of a harp that was snapped. Upalig Reb Shimon v'amar bebraisa oinvav, amar hachatayim lemilsa, upalig atana deleh. Reb Shimon explains the reason why only a bow and not a knot. V'amar lo yihutru b'mikdash ela shvus, ubetarti miflige milsa de Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon is here explaining two arguments. Reisha b'machshe chutz l'tchum, v'seifa b'nimas kinner. The first words, mishalach nasnulach, is talking about his explanation why you're allowed to go back into the tchum, and the second one is about you're only allowed to make a bow for the court. And this is what Reb Shimon is saying. Even though when it comes to leaving the Tchum Shabbos over there, I was Mr. Lenient, because I said that even if you left the Tchum Shabbos, as long as you're within 15 amas from the Tchum Shabbos, you could come back. So I'm lenient. Nonetheless, by the cord of the harp, I am stringent. I'll explain to you why. Over there, I'm lenient because I told you they made a mistake. They just let him come back to the Tchum because he never left the Tchum. He's still in his Tchum, so it's not a problem. But here, making a knot, that's a very serious issue. It can bring to an Isur, Derais, and a Chi of Chatas. So therefore, don't say, why am I lenient here and stringent here? I'll explain to you. Over there, it's Mishalach Nosalach. It's not a big deal. But over here, Lo Yitirulach Ela Mishmishvus. I only allow a bow because a bow is a rabbinic prohibition. But a knot could be biblical, or it can lead to a biblical prohibition, and therefore, I do not allow it. This concludes the Mesechta Eiruvin, the way Rashi explains it. Now, let's try to analyze this for a moment, because there is something very strange here. Reb Shimon suddenly, at the end of the last Mishnah, introduces two statements. One is Mishalach Nasnalach, and one is Mishalach Nasnalach, and the other one is what? That Lo Yitirulach Ela Mishum Shvus. Yeah? Two statements he introduced. The question is, what's the connection between these two statements that Reb Shimon feels that he has to explain why he's stringent by the harp, even though he's lenient by the Tchum Shabbos? They're completely two different halachas. It's not like Reb Shimon is talking about the same topic and he's lenient and then he suddenly becomes stringent, so he has to explain the distinction. One Mishnah is at the end of chapter 4, talking about Tchum Shabbos. This Mishnah here is talking about the harp in the Beis HaMikdash, making a knot. What's the connection between the two? That Reb Shimon suddenly has to remind himself, say, by the way, by the harp I'm stringent, by Tchum Shabbos I'm lenient, because it's a whole different... Maybe Reb Shimon should start discussing every time he's lenient and every time he's stringent in any topic, and then explain why here he's lenient, here he's stringent. We don't have that in Shas. The reason is, it's two different creatures, it's two different realities. And yet Reb Shimon feels over here when he's talking about the Kinner, he has to bring in something from 6 chapters ago because it looks like a contradiction. Why does it look like a contradiction? It's l'chatchila two completely different halachas. It's not like he's being lenient and stringent in the same topic, it's completely two different halachas. It's difficult to understand. Very difficult to understand. And that's why he brings something from 6 chapters ago which completely doesn't belong here. And it suddenly appears at the end of a Mishnah about sheretz. Which brings us to another question. How does it come in at the end of this Mishnah? Why is it here at the end of this Mishnah about sheretz? It should be at the end of the Mishnah about the harp. When we spoke about the harp that was interrupted, the Mishnah actually doesn't bring the view of Reb Shimon, but the Braisa brings the view of Reb Shimon. So over there, the Gemara or the Mishnah or the Braisa could bring what Reb Shimon said. It's a very strange thing. Over there where he speaks about it doesn't bring what Reb Shimon says. Suddenly here we're talking about a sheretz in the Beis HaMikdash completely disconnected to the harp. We suddenly bring what Reb Shimon says. About 6 chapters ago, Eruv Tchumen, and then also about the harp in the Beis HaMikdash, which is not even this Mishnah. Tosfos says, the last Tosfos of Mesechta Eiruvin, Tosfos says the reason it doesn't say in that Mishnah is because the Gemara felt, the Mishnah wanted to finish all the halachas connected to the Beis HaMikdash, because these Mishnahs discuss different halachas in the Beis HaMikdash versus outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and then explain what Reb Shimon says, after we finished all the ideas of the Beis HaMikdash. That's what Tosfos says. That's why we wait till the end. But even if that's the case, you didn't want to interrupt the halachas of the Beis HaMikdash, it should have been a separate Mishnah. The fact that it's in this Mishnah with Sheretz seems like it's connected to the Sheretz, but it's not, completely not. It's connected to a previous Mishnah about Nimas Kinner, so it should be in a separate Mishnah. If you don't want to put it over there in that Mishnah where it belongs, put it in a separate Mishnah. The fact that it's in the Mishnah of Sheretz, it seems like it's connected to this Mishnah. If you don't want to put it, if you could put it either in the Mishnah about Tchumen, about Chum Shabbos, or in the Mishnah about Nimas Kinner, yeah, or at least close to them, not in a Mishnah that's completely a different topic. Completely a different topic. There's also another question. Tosfos says that Mishalach Nasnu Lach and Lo Yitiru Lach Ela Mishum Shvuz, the last Tosfos of Mesechta Eiruvin. Yeah. Tosfos says that Mishalach Nasnu Lach is actually the same thing. What Reb Shimon is saying, the reason I'm lenient by Eiruvin is the reason I'm stringent by Nimas Kinner. Because basically the rabbis only allow things that are prohibited by the rabbis. In the words of Tosfos, Hasam lav kuluhu ela mishalach nostalach v'gam kan le nostalach ela mishalach dainu anivid avadavar amuter. The rabbis are not being lenient. It's mishalach nostalach. You're in the Tchum Shabbos. They let you be in the Tchum Shabbos. And here also, they let you do a bow because a bow is not biblically prohibited. In other words, it's the same point. I'm lenient here and I'm stringent here for the very same reason, because the rabbis allow you to do things that are not problematic biblically. If that's the case, according to Tosfos, why does Reb Shimon repeat this idea in two different statements and in two different sentences and in a completely different way? He could have just said, Makim sheitiru lechachamim mishalach nosnolach, and that's it. Because that explains both halachas, the halachas of Tchumen and the halachas of the cord of the kinner that was snapped. Why does Reb Shimon have to add Shelo yitiru lecha ela mishum shvus? What was the wrong with the first statement? Makim sheitiru lecha chachamim mishalach nosnolach. Especially the Mishnah, we know the Rambam says, is always brief and concise. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe proposed an explanation. And in order to appreciate the explanation, we have to explore a question that pervades halachic thinking throughout much of Shas. And the question is really one that expresses itself in many different areas in life. What trumps what? Eichos or kamos? Eichos means quality, kamos means quantity. If I have a lot of quantity, but it comes at the expense of quality, is that superior to something which is of better quality but of less quantity? Let me give a classic example. It's the Rebbe's example. He once did a Hadran on Mesechta Hoyriyos and B'chayros, and he discussed this. The original Chira comes from Rabbi Yosef Engel. Rabbi Yosef Engel was one of the great Goyim of Poland. He passed away, I think, in 1921, Tofresh Pei Aleph. The Rav of Bendin, Rabbi Yosef Engel, was one of the Goyim Hadar. And he wrote many Sfarim. There's a Machin now, a friend of mine here in Muncie has a Machin to publish all of the Sfarim of Rabbi Yosef Engel, because many of them were never published. They gave me an amazing Sfarim. Rabbi Yosef Engel was an exceptional Gaon. He has a sefer called Lekach Toiv. In Lekach Toiv, Klal, Tesvav, Tezayin, that zip code, he discusses the question of Eichos versus Kamos and Halacha. He gives a lot of examples. I'll give you one example that I heard from the Rebbe. He doesn't bring it in Lekach Toiv. The end of Mesechta Hoyriyos. The end of Mesechta Hoyriyos, the Gemara tells a story. Shalchul Taman, they sent a question from Eretz Yisrael, they sent a question. Sinai v'oike harim mi adif. If you have to choose a leader, a mentor, a teacher, should you choose a Sinai or an Eiker Harim? Sinai is somebody who's like Mount Sinai. He knows everything. He knows quantity, but he doesn't have the depth. He doesn't master it all the way to its core. He's what's called a bucky. It's tremendous knowledge. He can quote from everywhere, and he has it organized. Rashi says this: "Durin kinesinas and Sinai." Eiker Harim is somebody who can uproot mountains, including Har Sinai. He can uproot the mountain, meaning you give him an idea and he knows how to uproot it and question it and refute it and therefore go one step deeper and then yet deeper and deeper and deeper. Which quality would you say trumps in a teacher? Sinai, somebody who has encyclopedic knowledge, or Eiker Harim? It's a question of quantity versus quality. Another example, one search from the Rabbi, was making a siyum on Rosh Hashanah. Gemara in Brachas Daf Chav Ches. Fascinating Gemara. Rabbi Gamliel was the leader of the Sanhedrin. He had a policy. Kol mi shein toiche kabara lo yikanos lebeis hamedrash. If your inside was not like your outside, you can't go into the Beis Medrash. In other words, he only accepted krem da la krem. It wasn't only you were a good student, you had to be completely worked out on the inside. Rabbi Gamliel was dethroned because of a whole story with Rabbi Yeshua, Mesechta Brachas, Daf Chav Zayin, Agan Samayis, Tfilas Arvis Rishus. Who did they put in as a leader in lieu of Rabbi Gamliel? The young 18-year-old Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. What's the first thing he did? He got rid of the security guard. He got rid of the restrictions. Silkul Shaimer Pesach. He got rid of the security by the Beis Medrash, and he says whoever wants could come learn. And what happened? That day, the benches, the chairs in the Beis Medrash filled up. One opinion is there were 400 students. Another opinion, 800 students. And Gamliel felt very bad. He felt very bad that he prevented so much Torah from the Jewish people. What was the argument? And the Gemara tells a story. Rabbi Gamliel had a dream to comfort him, but it was only to appease him. What was the argument? Quantity versus quality. Rabbi Gamliel felt, I'll have a small crowd, I'll have a small yeshiva, but the quality, be creme de la creme, best of the best. The main thing is quality, eichos. In quantity, you're going to have few. That's fine. Quality trumps quantity. Eichos machriya kamas. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had the opposite approach. He said, no. I know if I let everybody in, I'm not going to have the same level yeshiva. I'm not going to have the same minds, the same hearts, the same souls. But the kamos, the quantity, is so much more important than the eichos. Let's change the subject. Aran, Rabbeinu Nissen, Mesechta Yuma. Rabbeinu Nissen, Mesechta Yuma. And it's discussed in Shulchan Aruch, Hilchos Shabbos, Erech Chaim, Shin Chav Ches. Fascinating question. Somebody is deathly ill. The person needs meat. They need to meat. So the doctor's orders. The problem is the only meat that's available is, let's say, horse meat or non-kosher meat. So here's the option. You can give him to eat the meat. It's pikuach nefesh. You're allowed to eat treif. To save a life, you can violate most of the Torah. Should we do that? Or maybe no. Let's get a sheichet. Let him slaughter a kosher cow, and we will serve him kosher meat. What's the difference? The difference is as follows. If he eats the horse meat, every kazayas, every volume of an olive, he transgresses a lav in the Torah. If he eats 10 kazesim, he committed 10 sins. He was allowed to, pikuach nefesh, but he committed 10 sins. If he shechts a kosher cow, he's going to eat kosher meat. So it's fine. So it's a no-brainer, but there's a big difference. Because shchita on Shabbos is an isur skila. Shchita on Shabbos has potentially death penalty. If there's witnesses, if there's warning. Isur nevela, eating a nevela is lav. It's an isur malchus. It's not an isur Mrs. Bezdin. There's no death penalty for eating treif. For eating non-kosher meat, for eating nevela, it's a lav. You're not allowed to do it. But it's not an isur skila. What trumps, quantity or quality? If we say quality transcends quantity, in other words, even if the quantity is less, but we follow quality, that's the main thing. So then which one should you choose? you should give him to eat the nevela, the non-kosher meat. Because even though in quantity he's doing 10 sins, but it's 10 sins of a lower quality. But if you say that quality trumps quantity, if you say quantity trumps quality, then shech the kosher meat, shech the kosher animal. Why? Because even though it's an isser of Mrs. Besdin, but it's one isser. It's only one. True, it's a much more stringent isser. The quality of the isser is much more stringent. The eichos is much more intense, but the eichos is much more intense, but the kamos is going to be only one. Versus if you give him the non-kosher meat, there's going to be 10 averis. Better do one aver than 10 averis, even though the one is more powerful. But 10 beats one. 10 beats one. There's a question that's brought in Sfarim, interesting question. Avram Avinu tells Sarah, tell them you're my sister. Why? If you tell them you're my wife, they'll kill me. Because they want you for Parah. So Parah will kill me, so he can marry you. If you tell them you're my sister, doesn't have to kill me. So the question is, 1 second. Why does he have to kill Avram Avinu to take Sarah? Let him take Sarah. Even if Avram is alive. The answer is, Parah is a frum guy. He doesn't want to marry an Eishes Ish. He doesn't want to marry a woman who's married. It's pasnished. So you got to kill the husband. 1 second. If you're such a frum guy, you don't want to be with a married woman. So why are you not frum enough not to murder somebody? What's Avram Avinu think? Avram Avinu is making a cheshbon for Parah. Kill me, he'll kill me. Why will he kill me? Because he doesn't want to marry Sarah when she's married. Why not? Because you're not supposed to, so why will he kill me? So one of the explanations is that Avram was saying that Parah was thinking to himself, murder is a one-time sin. One-time, very big sin. Shvichas dama. But then, the woman is permitted, she's a widow. But if she's married and he doesn't kill Avram Avinu, then every single time he's with her is an Isra of Gilui Arayos. No, what trumps what? What trumps what? Is it the quantity or the quality? The Lekach Tov brings a lot of more examples to prove different directions in Shas. Yeah, I'll give you an example from the Lekach Tov, another very interesting example. Let me ask you a question. If you want to give $100,000 for tzedakah, yeah, do you give it to one institution or one person who desperately needs it and you change their whole life? Or you say, no, I'll give $1,000 to 100 people. Or I'll give $500 to 200 people. Now, $500 is not going to make a big difference. But the quantity trumps the quality. Yeah, the quality is not, you're not doing a major contribution, or remaking their life. But the quantity, you gave 200 people tzedakah. Or you say, no, the quality. You gave one person, one institution, or two, or three, or four. And that's what's goiver. That's the question. Rabbi Yosef Engel quotes a Mishnah in Avos Perek Gimel, HaKoy lefi roiv hamaisa. So the Rambam says that to give 100 times tzedakah, each time you give, say, a nickel, each time you give a quarter, 100 times, is better than giving all those in one shot to a poor person. Why? Why? So he says, Ribuyai spilus adif migoidel hai spilus. Doing a good thing many, many times, you gave tzedakah 100 distinct times, is greater than giving one big time tzedakah, even though you're giving much more. He says, you see, quantity is more powerful than quality. There's a question today in psychology, they talk about trauma a lot. Yeah, there's a trauma, a person has something in their life that is traumatic. They could look at it and say, this was a traumatic event. It was a dramatically traumatic event. But sometimes there's a different type of trauma. And that is kamos, not echos. If you identify it, nothing happened. But it happened over and over and over. day in, day out, week after week, month after month. Which one is more powerful? It's not so clear. They used to think there's an identifiable trauma that this person endured. Obviously, there's a serious situation. But today they're realizing that's not the case. Yes, that is the case. But sometimes, that little bit of trauma that's accumulated, the cumulative power of quantity, even though it's not quality. If you pluck out each one in a vacuum, it doesn't seem so dramatic. But the cumulative effect, one and another and another and another, makes a dent. Like Rabbi Akiva speaks about, right? He saw the drops of water, and after years and years and years, it made that dent in the rock. Was it a big rush of water? Was it a ferocious flood of water? No. But it's the cumulative power of quantity, of kamos. I'll give you another very interesting example, and then we'll move on. Hoyri is daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, also from Rabbi Yosef Engel. Seiras yachid koidemes lekifsas yachid. If you have an individual did an aveira, he has to bring a carbon chatos. Aveira b'shayv, bring a carbon chatos. What does he bring? He could bring either a female sheep or a female goat, a kifsa or a sira. So the Hoyri Yisud Gimel tells us you have two karbanas, two people bring. One brought a female goat for a carbon chatas, the other one a female sheep. The goat comes first. Asks the Gemara, the Braisa says, no. The sheep comes first, the female sheep comes first, the ewe comes first. So Abaye says, it's an argument. It's machloikas tanoim, and I'll explain to you why. Mar sovar seira adifa shekenis rapsa eitzel akum biyachid. The first Tana holds a female goat is superior and therefore gets precedence. You know why? Because when somebody worships idolatry inadvertently, they have to bring a female goat, not a sheep. So we see from here that a female goat has more greater spiritual power for atonement. All other sins that you do inadvertently and they have to bring a chatos, you can bring a goat or a sheep. But by Avodah Zarah, which is considered the cardinal sin of Judaism, there you gotta bring a goat. So that's the shit of this Tana. The other Tana holds the female sheep comes first. You know why? Because by a sheep, the halacha is that even the aliyah, the fatty tail, is also offered on the altar and it's consumed in the flames. By a goat, you don't put the tail. The tail doesn't go on the mizbeach. What's the argument? Says the Lekach Toiv. This is the argument. By a sheep, the mizbeach eats up much more of the animal because there's a fatty tail besides the other fat that you offer on the mizbeach. So he says, when you're looking at quality, the sheep's quality is greater than the goat's quality is greater than the sheep. Why? Because there's something about the goat that has a spiritual power that the sheep doesn't have. And I'll prove it to you. Even for the sin of idolatry, it can atone. The sheep can't. Sheep can atone for lighter sins. But for the serious heavyweights, for Avodah Zarah, you need a goat. This means that in Eichos, the goat has a prominence, it has a chshivas, it has a spiritual significance to it that the sheep doesn't have. Therefore, if you look at Eichos, the goat trumps, so the goat comes first. But if you look at Kamos, the carbon that's going to Hashem, where is there more of a carbon? So the sheep and the goat may be more or less same in size, but by the sheep, you bring more onto the mizbeach. So in terms of quantity, the sheep is a bigger carbon than the goat. So therefore, he holds that the sheep comes first. The words of the Lekach Tov, Hakivsa yesh lamaylis ribui hakamos sham mizbeach oichel mimena yoyser mashoichel menasira gamal yasa kreva. On the other hand, seira yesh lamayla echusis al kivsa. By a shayga of the Zara, the keves doesn't have the koyach for kapara. Rak hasi'ira levada hida mechaperes. V'arezu plukte b'svaras haran hanal iribui hakamos machriyas eichos. This is the same machlokas what we spoke before from the Ran. The question, if we serve the chayla on a vela, even though there's many isurim because the isur is less and eichos is machriya kamos, or better, we serve what? We serve the kosher cow, because kamos is machriya eichos. Numbers matter. In fact, the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is that you shech the kosher cow. Instead of feeding the horse meat, you shech the kosher, even though shchita is an isur skilla, but you shech that. So it's a proof from there that what? That kamos machriya eichos. And that's why you don't want chilul Shabbos in kamos, you would rather chilul Shabbos in eichos. It's not mamash a clear raya because the Rishonim give other reasons why. Famous reason, because a Jew, he may get disgusted from non-kosher meat, a Jew gets disgusted from non-kosher meat. And other reasons, there's the reason from that's the reason from the Rosh, there's another reason from the Ravid. It's discussed in Shulchan Aruch Harav in Siman Shin Chof Ches, in Hilchos Shabbos. Two ways of looking at things, kamos and eichos. What's machriya? What's machriya in life, kamos or eichos? And as the Lekech Toiv said, Rebbe Engel says, you see in Shas, different ways, different perspectives. When it comes to Sinai and Ekaharim, the answer was Sinai Adif. The Baki is Adif. Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, the verdict was like him. Let all the Talmidim into the Beis Medrash. So over there you see constantly that kamos is machriya eichos. You see here by the sheep and the goat that there's different perspectives. Hakol afi reiva ma'aseh, the Rambam. You see again that kamos has a power over eichos. If this is the case, says the Rebbe, let's come back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, the last Mishnah of Mesechta Eiruvin, has something so perplexing. The Mishnah speaks about a sheretz, and then suddenly it diverts and goes off to Reb Shimon, and at first glance, the theme of Reb Shimon is completely disconnected. Unless we take it one step deeper. What's the argument between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broike and Rabbi Yehuda about the sheretz? What's the difference if I take it out with my belt or I take it out with my wooden tongues? So the Gemara explains, if I take it out with my belt, the tumah was removed immediately, but it grew. From being located in the sheretz, it now traveled also to my gartel. So now you have the sheretz's tumah now impacted the outside world in an intense way. The tumah has grown. If I take it out with wooden tongues, the tumah may have remained much longer in the Beis HaMikdash, maybe another 10 minutes, maybe another half an hour, maybe another 2 hours, depends when you found the wooden tongues, because they were not necessarily available. However, the tumah did not grow, because the wooden tongues are not makabel tumah. What's the logic of that machlek? Rabbi Yochanan ben Broike says the main thing is loy lahashes es hatuma. Rabbi Yehuda says the main thing is loy laharbos es hatuma. What's the argument? Stam an argument? No. This is a general principle that pervaded their perspectives. What is more important in the world of halacha? Kamos or eichos? Rabbi Yochanan ben Broike says the main thing is shaloi lahashes es hatuma. The fact that the tumah grows, the tumah goes beyond itself, the tumah blossoms, it affects also the avneit, which is also tameh. Yes, we would have preferred that not to have that. But better to have that than to keep the tumah longer in the Beis HaMikdash. Because even though the tumah is not going to grow, but nonetheless, the fact that it's going to remain for another 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes in the Beis HaMikdash is much less desirable. Kamos is machriya eichos. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broike. Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't agree. Eichos is machriya kamos. Even if you can get rid of the tumah right away. But how are you going to get rid of the tumah right away? By making the tumah grow. The tumah is going to grow. It's going to be zich mispashet. It's going to have a hashpah. It's going to create something else that's tameh. And therefore, rather let the tumah remain longer in the Beis HaMikdash, even though that means in kamos and quantity, the tumah remains, instead of 5 minutes, it remains for 20 minutes. But it's much better to have that and use wooden tongues than to get rid of the tumah immediately, but have the tumah grow. So we have here two perspectives. One shitta is kamos machriya eichos, and one shitta is eichos machriya kamos. If this is the case, now we'll understand very well the connection to Reb Shimon. Let's talk about the cord of a kinnor, of a harp, that was snapped. I'm a Levi, I'm a Ben Levi, I'm playing the harp on Shabbos, and the cord breaks, it snaps. What happens now? Tanakama says, tie it. It snapped, tie it back. Don't make a knot, a good knot. Of course, don't have in mind that this should be a permanent knot forever, because then it's a biblical violation. But make a knot. Maybe you're going to leave it there because it's good already. Nobody will bother fixing it and it's going to remain permanent. Okay, but you're allowed to do it in the Beis HaMikdash. As I told you, Rashi even holds you're allowed to make a biblical knot, a permanent knot in the Beis HaMikdash. Koshra. Reb Shimon says no, make a bow. Reb Shimon holds a bow is forbidden. He says it's a shvus. You're right, but in the Beis HaMikdash, I'm letting you make a bow. A bow is not biblical. It can't be biblical, even if you have in mind that you want to leave it there permanently. It can't be biblical because by definition, a bow is an impermanent knot. It's not something that endures for eternity. It's not a kesher shel kayom. If you remember, the end of Mesechta Shabbos is all about this. Poikekin or moededim v'koshim b'Shabbos. We did the siyum on Shabbos at length. Kesher, what a kesher is. It's not a kesher shel kayom. As Reb Shimon says, it's fine. Now, let's think about this in terms of kamos and eichos. There's an advantage in making a knot. There's an advantage in making a bow. What's the advantage in making a knot, and what's the disadvantage in making a knot? What's the advantage in making a bow? What's the disadvantage in making a bow? Let's think about this. The problem in making a knot is there's a very big disadvantage. It can bring l'dei chiyuv chatas. If I make a knot, it's very possible that the Levi who's knotting it makes a good and tight knot, like let's say a double knot or a triple knot, so it holds very tight. And you know what? If he decides that this is a good knot, let it stay there. This is a biblical kesher. That's a very serious isser. It's one of the avos malachis. It's an isser skilla. It's a chiyuv chatas. So it's a very serious type of isser, if he does it that way. That's the disadvantage in kshira. What's the advantage in a bow? The advantage in a bow is it could never be a biblical prohibition. I don't care what you're thinking. This bow is not permanent. At worst, at most, it's a rabbinic prohibition, but not more. That's the gewaldige advantage in a bow versus a knot. But 1 second. Let's think for a moment from the other perspective. Is there a disadvantage in a bow versus a knot? Yes, there is a disadvantage in a bow versus a knot, and I'll tell you why. A knot holds. That's why it could be permanent. So once this Levi ties this knot on Shabbos, right? Shabbos morning, it's going to stay. It's a good knot. It's going to stay. Let's hope that Mitzvah Shabbos, he'll undo it, so it shouldn't be a permanent knot. But it's going to stay. A bow, why is a bow only rabbinic at best, according to the Shimon? Some say it's not, but according to the Shimon, why is a bow rabbinic? Why? Why can't it be biblical? The answer is because it's completely not permanent. Sooner or later, it's going to be undone. It's not going to last. If that's the case, it's very likely, or at least there's a very strong possibility that on Shabbos it's going to be undone and you're going to have to do the bow again. And it may happen again. And it may happen again. So here we have the same question. What wins? What's more important, kamos or eichos? If we look at eichos as more important than kamos, so then I say, you know what? I don't care if you make 10 bows on Shabbos, but it's rabbinics. It's rabbinics. It's 10 bows. I don't care. Yes, it's 10 versus 1 knot, but come on, how could you compare? It's apples versus Mount Everest. You can't compare it. Not apples and oranges. So therefore, make 10 bows. Or you say, no. A bow is a rabbinic prohibition. Better make 1 knot, even though making a knot in quality is more problematic than making a bow, because it could bring l'dei chiyuv chatas, but it's a one-time act. Get it over with, and you're done. In quality, it's more serious, or it could be more serious. A bow can't get that serious. True, but maybe 10 bows versus 1 knot. The knot should win, because kamos is more important than eichos, or is eichos more important than kamos? So the same question we had by the sheretz, we have by the nimas kinner, kamos or echos. Now, let's go to the Tchum Shabbos. It's exactly the same question. Let's understand this. Chazal tell us, and it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, in Hilchos Eiruvin, mitzvah lachzer beinacher v'chatzeres beinacher shetufim mevoyos. Siman Shin Sadek Hey in Torah and Shulchan Aruch. It's a mitzvah to make an Erev Chatzeres. It's a mitzvah to make a Shetufim Mevoyos. It's a mitzvah to allow people to carry in more places. Why? So the Mefarshim explained, the Prisha, the Beis Yosef, it's part of Einik Shabbos. I could take a walk in the courtyard. I can go eat by a neighbor. We can eat together outside. It's part of Einik Shabbos. When somebody left town, it comes Shabbos, and they're outside of the Tchum. They're outside of the Tchum. We all understand this is going to compromise their Einik Shabbos because they can't be in the city. They can't be at home. They can't be in anybody else's home. Mitzad Einik Shabbos, the place to be on Shabbos is in the border of the city, the Tchum Ha'ir, so that you could go walk around in the whole city, in the whole village. You can even go 2,000 amas from each direction outside of the city. On the other hand, if Friday night you made your tchum outside of the border of the city, and now you have 2,000 amas in one direction, you're extremely limited. You're limited where you can go, what you can, even if you have a meal. I'm not talking about if you're going to starve, even if you have a meal. But you can't compare a bed, a couch, company, shul, a shiur, family. You can't compare it. You can't compare. If we say you have to make Eiruvin Chatzeres because of Einik, it's a mitzvah to make Eiruvin Chatzeres. It doesn't mean it's an obligation. It's no obligation. But it's a mitzvah, meaning it's a very good thing to do. It's something that's highly, highly encouraged by Chazal. Why? Even though you have a house, you don't have to eat outside with your neighbor, but it increases the Einik Shabbos. Certainly you understand that if you don't even have a house, you're outside in the wilderness, certainly it's not an Einik Shabbos like being in the Tchum Shabbos. So somebody who left the Tchum, if he can get back into the Tchum Shabbos, there's actually an element of a mitzvah here. It's the right thing to do. It's not just permission. It's the right thing to do. Because if you're not going to go back into the Tchum of Shabbos, your Einik Shabbos will be seriously compromised, if not significantly obliterated. If so, comes Reb Shimon and says, Kamos trumps echos. Even if kamos means less quality, it's still more powerful than greater quality with less quantity. Reb Shimon says, if you went out of the Tchum Shabbos, even though there's a serious issue here, and the issue here is if you go back in, you may be violating the problem of Tchum Shabbos, because even though Reb Shimon said that the marker is not accurate, but as the Mefarshim explain, it may be accurate, it may not be accurate. It may be accurate, it's till 14 amas, till 13 amas, till 12 amas. In other words, we're not sure. You may be violating the problem of Tchum Shabbos. So even though, Reb Shimon says, even though, by going into the Tchum Shabbos, you may not, because it's not accurate, but you may be violating the inyan of Tchum Shabbos. And how are you doing it? Through kum v'aseh. You're doing an act. You're going into Tchum Shabbos. What's the alternative? The alternative is just stay in your spot. Stay in your spot, sleep there. You'll have a lot of time to think. Maybe if you brought a book, so you also have a book to read or a sefer to learn, maybe you can finish Mesechta Eiruvin there. But you're not going to be doing an active thing. You'll be passive. So what should trump what? I would say let him stay. That's what Tanna Kama says. Tanna Kama says he's there, let him be there. Don't bring him back into the Tchum. Nonetheless, Reb Shimon says go back in, even though this is a kum v'aseh versus a sheval tasa, because if he stays outside, he's staying outside. He's not doing anything. He's not having the full Einik Shabbos, okay? But he's not actively doing something that's an Isser. Here, he may be actively doing an Isser. So there's a choice. Comes Reb Shimon and says, yes, I don't care. Let him go back into the Tchum. You know why? Because if I keep him outside every single moment of Shabbos, he's losing Einik Shabbos. If he goes in, even if it was the wrong thing to do, it's one moment. It's 1 moment. So even though going in is a much more serious violation of a rabbinic Isser Shabbos than staying outside, nonetheless, I say go in and don't stay outside, because going in is 1 moment. You'll go into the Tchum and it's over. And staying outside is going to be for the next 24 hours. And Kamos wins over Eichos. In other words, if I can do something, if I can violate an Isser, and the quality of the Isser is more serious, but it's going to be 1 moment, and my alternative is I violate an Isser that's of much lesser quality, but in quantity it's more, it's longer, the accumulativeness, the accumulation of quantity trumps quality. And therefore the Shimon says, go back in to the Tchum Shabbos, unlike Tanakama. Maybe Tanakama doesn't even argue. Tanakama just says that the Rabbanan are not really arguing. Maybe they also hold that Kamos is Machriya Eichos. They just hold that the markers were very, very accurate. And because the markers were very, very accurate, therefore, you can't do it, because the Chacham are not going to let him violate the Isser of Tchumen. Here it's a suffix, so they let him do it. So it could be that Tanakama is not even arguing. If this is the case, we have here in this Mishnah 3 situations that are all dependent on Kamos and Eichos. So it all fits beautifully. The Sheretz, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Reika, and Rabbi Yehuda, Kamos or Eichos. Tchumen, Kamos or Eichos. If you say Eichos wins, Eichos is more important, let him stay outside. Reb Shimon says Kamos is more important, he should go inside. Because if he stays outside, every moment is a bittul of Einik Shabbos. If he goes in, 1 moment of Isser Tchum, perhaps. So Kamos wins Eichos. In the case of Nimas Kinner, same question. If Eichos wins Kamos, if Eichos is more important than Kamos, then what do you say? Do Aniva, don't do Kshira. If Kamos is more important than Eichos, I would rather you do a Kshira, even though it could be more stringent, rather than doing Aniva, 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 Aniva. So in all 3 situations in this Mishnah, we have this question of Kamos versus Eichos. So it's not those disjointed issues that Mishnah suddenly starts talking about Tchumen and Nimas Kinna. It's disconnected to the Sheretz. It's connected to this theme. But for this, we have to go to the Pnimius of the Machlaikas. If we look at the argument from a superficial point of view, it's Sheretz, it's Tchumen, it's Kinas Nimmer. If we look at the Machlaikas from a deeper thematic point of view, it's a Machlaikas about Kamos versus Eichos. So therefore, it's clear that the Mishnah has a joint theme. But now we have a big problem. What's the problem? If Reb Shimon holds that Kamos trumps Eichos, and that's why you shouldn't stay outside, like Tanakama, you should go back into the Tchum Shabbos, then what should he hold by the harp? By the harp, he should have the same svara. That what? You should do the Kshira, not the Aniva. Because Kamos is more important than Eichos. Let him do 1 Isur Kshira rather than many Isurei Aniva. This is now the problem. So Reb Shimon comes and tells you, and explains to you what he's thinking. So now we'll understand the connection of these 2 statements and why he has to say 2 different statements and why it comes into this Mishnah and why one is connected to the other one even though it's 6 chapters earlier. Because it's not about Tchum Shabbos and Nimas Kinner. It's about Kamos and Eichos. So once you get a bird's eye view of Torah and you start seeing the inner theme, then I don't care if it's 6 chapters ago. I have to talk about it here because I have a serious contradiction. Nimas Kinner is contradicting Eruv Tchumen, even though it's 2 separate halachas. It's not just here I was stringent, here I was lenient. There's a lot of Mishnahs where Rabbi Shimon is stringent in one area, in another area. Here it's the same issue, Kamos and Eichos, and he's contradicting himself. In one situation, he's doing Kamos versus Eichos. Kamos wins over Eichos by Tchumen, and by Nimas Kinner, Eichos wins over Kamos. It's not fair. This is already a problem. This is a problem. You're typhus. The Chevra typhus. So the Shimon has to explain. So what does he explain? So he says, the Shimon says, don't compare. By Eruv Tchumen, by Tchumen, I was Mekel, because I didn't want Kamos. That's true. By the Kinner, I'm Machmir, a machmir, that you shouldn't do kshira. Why? Why there do I want kamos? The answer is shlo yitiru lecha ela mishum shvus. They were only matir when you're dealing with shvus, when the echos and the kamos are both shvus. Meaning, when I'm telling you that the kamos trumps the echos, it's only if they're ultimately in the same genre, in the same realm, in the same category. Either it's both an issa d'oraisa, or it's both an issa d'rabbanan. For example, the sick person, if he eats the horse meat, it's an issa d'oraisa. If they shech the cow, it's an issa d'oraisa. It's both an issa d'oraisa. The question is, which issa should I choose? I say, kamos wins echos. And because by eating the horse meat, it's going to be 10 issur d'oraisa, and shechting the cow is going to be 1 issur d'oraisa, 1 I go with, and I don't want to do 10. Got it. If it's both an issur d'rabbanan, also kamos machri echos, like by tchumen. If I stay outside, it's not an issur d'oraisa. Issur d'oraisa, I could stay wherever I want on Shabbos. It's a problem on a rabbinic level. It's not the complete Einik Shabbos. Again, it's not mamish a chiyuv to go in, but it's a problem on a rabbinic level. Okay. Going back in is not an issur d'oraisa. It's a tchum of 2,000 amas is a d'rabbanan. It's a d'rabbanan. And here it's a suffix. I'm not even sure. So it's a d'rabbanan versus a d'rabbanan. I say it's a kamos. Kamos wins. That, yeah. But lo yitiru l'chelem shvus. If the kamos and the echos are both a shvus. But in this case, by the kinnah, what do you want? You want that the ribuy hakamos of an aniva, which is a d'rabbanan, should triumph over the echos of kshira, which could bring to a d'oraisa. Sorry, that we don't do. The echos of a d'oraisa trumps the kamos d'rabbanan. To give maybe a very, good example, but a very simple example. You say, what would you like more? One big zetz, one big clap that's going to hurt, right? Or 50 small claps? Okay, it's a good question. It's a good question. Kamos or echos, right? Kamos or echos? What's worse? The accumulation of the patch, one after another, non-stop, or one big one? Okay, it's a good question. Kamos or echos. But what happens if it's not 50 small ones versus one big one? The one big one is a completely different level. It's going to turn the person into an invalid. Chas v'shalom. Now it's not a question anymore. Now it's not 50 small ones versus one big one, but they're in the same genre. Here the one big one is going to destroy his life. That's what he says. It's a whole different vart. It's not if I do 10 bows, it's 10 d'rabbanans. If I do one knot, it's more serious, it's more echos, but it's a d'rabbanan. That's not a vart. If I do the one knot, it can be an issur d'oraisa. That's a different realm. It could be so even though there's going to be more isurim in quantity, but they're going to be isurim d'rabbanan. The kesher, I'm going to do only one issur, but it's of a different genre. It's an issur d'oraisa. And proof of this is from the very sif and Shulchan Aruch about the sick man who you have to serve the non-kosher meat, or the kosher meat which you have to slaughter on Shabbos. The same halacha in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Chav Ches. It's over there in the Ramah, the Magen Avram, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Discuss another option. What if the sick person doesn't need meat? He needs wine. He needs wine. So the halacha is, if you have to have wine, so bring him wine, but you have to heat up the wine. You have to put the wine on fire and heat it up. That's what he needs for his recovery. So the halacha is, let the Jew fill up the wine and let the non-Jew warm up the wine over the fire. What's the issue? The issue here is, it's going to be an issa medivrei sofrim. What's the issa medivrei sofrim? The issa medivrei sofrim is, it could be kosher wine. But the non-Jew is warming up the wine and handling the wine. It's called stam yena. It's not yayin nesach min ha-Torah, but it's an issa midrabanan. So if it's an issa midrabanan, so let's think about this, okay? If the Jew warms up the wine, puts on the fire and warms up the wine, it's one issa. If the guy warms up the wine, and you're allowed to tell a guy to do malacha for a sick person, that's not a problem. The guy warms up the wine, it's stam yeinam, which you're not allowed to drink. And every few ounces that you drink is an isur. So why did the halacha change? Let the Jew warm up the wine. It'll be one isur of a Jew cooking wine. But then he's drinking good wine, Jewish wine. So you say, no. Let the guy heat up the wine, even though it's stam yeinam, it's asur b'derabanan, it's yayin nesach b'derabanan. And every time you drink, every revius is a new isur. Why? What happened? By the cow, you told me to go to the kosher cow. Why don't you tell me here to go to the kosher wine? The answer is because stam yeinam is an isur d'Rabbanan. Here I don't say kamos and eichos, the same cheshbon like before. When it was both isurim min ha-Torah, kamos is machriya eichos. So better to do the shechting than giving him non-kosher horse meat, because kamos is machriya eichos. 10 isurim min ha-Torah are worse than 1 isur min ha-Torah, even though that 1 isur is more stringent, more chamor. So the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is shech the kosher animal, because kamos is more powerful than eichos. But here, if it's not just kamos is more powerful than eichos, you would have to say kamos d'Rabbanan is more powerful than eichos min ha-Torah. That we don't say. That we don't say. And therefore let the goy warm up the wine. The guy will warm up the wine, the guy will heat up the wine. It's an isur stam yeinam, fine, but we didn't do an isur min ha-Torah. The Jew filled up the wine, and the guy heated it up, it's fine. That's what Reb Shimon is saying. This halacha that we see in Siman Shin Chav Ches, in Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Balatanya, the Rav Shulchan Aruch is masbered barichas, in Siman Shin Chav Ches Sif Tezayin. This is what Reb Shimon is saying. Because it's mishum shvus. First he says, I was matrid because it's not a real Tchum Shabbos. We're not sure it's a Tchum Shabbos, and therefore we let you come back. Then I tell you, why am I contradicting myself by Nimas Kinner? Because this heter is only shvus. But when you have a Daraisa versus a Darabanan, then we don't say this Kamos versus Echos. If so, we now see why it all belongs in this one Mishnah. It's connected to the theme of the Mishnah. Why Reb Shimon uses both languages. Why Reb Shimon suddenly connects a halacha from 6 chapters ago to this halacha. At Kan, the first part of the explanation of how the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained, it's one point, this was one point, a few minutes of the siyum of explaining this Nakud in the Mishnah. Now we have to go over to the whole next section of the Siyum on Eiruvin, which is going to deal with the more hashkafic, spiritual, psychological dimension of Eiruvin. However, because of the late hour, so let me just see the schedule here. Maybe we'll be able to do this tomorrow.